Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining. We're really excited to show you some of the awesome components and features in the Talend product. So as a quick way of background, this is Josh Vila from TESCHGlobal. For those of you, most of you know who we are, but for those of you who don't, TESCHGlobal, we have been developing and implementing data management and software solutions going on 12 years now. And the areas of expertise we like to focus in is in the data integration space, both from a B2B perspective and data warehousing and analytic perspective. We help our clients build their solutions and strategies and help keep them at the forefront of the available modern technology solutions that are out there today. And projects we like to focus on are around big data, real-time processing and offloading, Internet of Things, connected devices, and full stack development, again, using these open source tools. So kind of fitting into our theme and our approach and methodology is an awesome product called Talend. Most of you are familiar with Talend and some may not be, but we've been gold partners for Talend for over 4 years now. And today we're going to give you a demo of the continuous integration feature that is available in Talend. Reason for having this webinar and demonstration is we successfully implemented the continuous integration feature at a very large client in Illinois a few weeks back, and there was a lot of uproar of success and around the project, and a lot of people were amped, and so we want to keep everybody amped. And so we thought, let's just share with the community, and so that's why we're here today. So big shout out and thank you for the Talend team. You know who you are, for not only creating an awesome tool, but for letting us share our experience today with the community. So without further ado, let me introduce Robert Griswold, who is our VP of Professional Services. Robert has been implementing and developing data management solutions for 20 years now, and he leads our technical team of architects and developers throughout the globe. So without further ado, Robert, please kick it off and take it away. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, hello. Thank you, and thank you for joining. So I'm going to start out here with really, kind of defining a few terms. What is DevOps? And DevOps is really, software and infrastructure coming closer together in terms of collaboration, communication, and automation. And the goals are really to to make things rapid, agile, to frequently do things like frequent collaboration, check-in, check-out, building and testing your software, and even in some of the advanced phases, you hear continuous integration, but also continuous deployment. And a term I kind of like to use, release management. I was a release manager in a former life. So we'll get started down that path. Continuous integration, what does that mean? And what that means is you're building software and you have a team, and you're checking in your code, or in Talend's case, we're really checking in a lot of metadata and data that you generate from the studio, drag and drop, which later is converted to Java code. You can have some Java code in the source code libraries to kind of customize and supplement the components, drag and drop components using Talend API. So once that collaboration is done, the assumption is you're going to probably check in at least daily, so other people can pick up your changes, and integrate those into what they're doing, and maybe do some, something beyond a unit test to help them. So within the CI process itself, it's basically a checkout in Talend's case. So for Talend data management, you're going to develop your jobs, collaborate, and then when the continuous integration process starts, you're going to check it out. You're going to generate the Java source code. You're going to compile that code, run tests, and then at that point, you want to package the code. And the reason you're going to package the code is because you really don't want to have to compile that version of code again. So you're going to create a zip and then publish that to Nexus. So Nexus is a Maven repository, and that's really, anytime you use Java anymore, your runtimes or whatever, you're basically working with Maven and libraries in Maven. So the big distinction is Git is kind of source, or what's used to generate source. Maven is really the end product artifact. That's really what you're going to run and deploy, or in the opposite order, deploy and then run. So, and on top of this, most people and most customers that I saw, you start out in a manual process. So you're going to do a lot of these activities in the CI process manually, probably before you implement continuous integration. But I think I'm seeing maybe that's not happening as much with the tools and what Talend's putting out. I think you can get started sooner than you think and kind of move up to that level of maturity. Where it kind of takes a lot of extra work is actually generating those test cases. And I shouldn't say it's a lot of extra work. It's just a change in habit, maybe, for your data integration tools. So, that's kind of the whole reason. One of the big reasons we're doing this is because you're going to be running your test. So, the CI architecture, what does it consist of? Jenkins. Jenkins is a web app. That's the automation tool. And it's basically going to do everything we just talked about using Maven. Maven's to use to build and store libraries and artifacts. Git, again, is a source place. Nexus is where you have the artifacts. And there's also other things in Nexus too, like libraries and software updates. So just kind of think of Nexus as kind of a library. You check things out if you want to use them. And command line. Command line is really very similar to the Studio. It's an Eclipse framework that runs as a script or as a service. And you're going to use that to do a lot of things that you can do from the Studio. And CI Builder is a plugin for Jenkins, and that'll make more sense as I show you at a high level how that works. Talend Administrative Console is where you would do things manually and configuring Jenkins. You'll be using the TAC. So, and then beyond this, and this is kind of beyond kind of what people typically start out as. You could actually create scripts to run command line to do things beyond what's typically done, like from building your code to running your tests. You can actually create scripts that will do things like version or publish, change versions in Git, or publish to a distinct version in Nexus. So if you have 600 jobs, you're probably not going to want to go in and manually and change your versions in Git or in Nexus. And I'll show you more about what that means. So the manual system development lifecycle, I'll kind of show you what that means. If you go into the administrative console, most people have probably created tasks from jobs. And then when you create a task, you're actually going to grab, that code, check it out, generate it, or there's some other options as well. And then you're going to deploy and run that. And I'll just show you that real quick, what manual processes look like here. I'm working on everything I'm doing is on a virtual machine today, so bear with me here. So in Job Conductor, you're basically going to be able to create tasks and not wanting to cooperate here. You're going to create tasks and generate those tasks and deploy those tasks. And basically, when you're generating those, it's going to use command line. So that's one option. The other option is to publish from either the Studio or Nexus manually. And that way you build that code, and then that built code, again, that's going to use command line, publish it to Nexus, and then you could actually deploy that publish artifact to a job server and a task. So that's kind of the manual process. And the other thing too is in the publish, you can actually publish all of the jobs to Nexus. But once you check all jobs, it takes away the flexibility of being able to have a separate published version. And I'll go more into what that means in a little bit here, because okay, where are we at now? So here's the publisher. So, and it's not Talend Slow, it's my virtual machine. I'm just running a lot on one machine. So here's the publisher. You can grab a job, publish it to Nexus, and you see down here, you have a published version, and this is what's in Nexus. So you could really kind of, as you make changes in your daily builds or your daily check-ins, you can publish those versions under a different Maven version for each build. And I strongly recommend doing that for a release. And the reason why I really, and typically we don't recommend that you version in Git is because the code in Git, you can version the jobs, but the metadata is not versioned. So it could be confusing to people. So I just don't personally, like to version jobs in Talend. And I'll go a little bit over what that means in terms of a release. You could tag builds and you can tag releases. And then from there, you can publish to Nexus. So, and I'll go into branching strategies. And that's usually what is the decision point, is how do you version, how do you branch, for releases and production support versus what's getting developed for the next release on the trunk. So the job conductor, let's see. Well, I'll move on. Everybody's probably seen job conductor. So that's the manual process. And you could really do that. And that's the way most people start out. Here's the automated process. So you basically have a studio, you're doing collaboration, somebody checks it in, and you start the CI process. And the reason I have not necessarily this process, the CI process is not always triggered by a commit, because sometimes if you're in the cloud environments and you have very tight security, your network engineers might not let you open up a port that's going to receive communications from Git, and we have seen that. So that way, if you're checking in once a day, just assume that you're going to schedule the CI once a day. And honestly, do you really want to run the CI every time you commit? I think in some Java environments, it's just makes sense. In some software areas, there could be a lot of overhead and a lot of compute costs associated with that. So I think if you're committing once a day, might schedule it once a day, or open up the ports and let the Jenkins plugin receive a commit notification from Git, and Jenkins start the CI process. So once you check out the source code, the next thing you do is generate source. So you just, at that point, it's just XML that you check out of Git. You're generating Java source code with the command line and CI builder plugin for Jenkins. So that's really the first job. The first job, you're checking out the code. You're using the CI builder plugin and command line to generate source code. So job one, it's just source code. And I kind of name those kind of accordingly: check out and generate sources. That's the first job. Job number two is going to take those generated sources and actually compile those so they can be executed and run tests. That's the second job. And then the third job, you're going to take that compiled code and actually package it. You're going to create a zip file and publish it to Nexus. So it's really 3 jobs in Jenkins, and really not that tough to set up. I mean, it's kind of scary if you've never done it before, and if your systems people and your developers haven't done it. There's just a few things that you just have to kind of understand beyond the documentation, because Talend's documentation in this area is kind of a guide. You're probably going to want to customize it to your needs. So, and the other thing I want to kind of point out right now is, when you're talking in terms of DevOps and Talend, I would strongly leverage Talend jobs to automate the process. And I'll show you what that means. You can create jobs that call command line scripts, to do things like change versions or to publish all of your jobs under like a release version, a Nexus version, or anything that, think of anything that you can do in command line or in the studio. You can create a script to do it in command line and do it against all of the jobs in kind of in a more efficient way than doing it manually. Same thing with Studio or with TAC. You can use MetaServlet to automate those, and you can do that in a job as well. So I'm going to start out and just show you the first process of what that looks like in Jenkins. And let me pull up my web app here. So this is what Jenkins looks like. So it's really, you download a WAR file, drop it into a Tomcat server, and then go to the URL. And the configuration I did was very simple. So let me get out to the right level here, get logged in again. Manage Jenkins. So you kind of see the architecture through this configuration, what Jenkins really uses. So you have a JDK, Java 1.8 for Talend 6. You have a Git libraries. You have Maven installation. In a lot of these cases, people usually do the install automatically. So it's fairly simple to install. I used an install version of Git because I needed that to actually install the CI Builder plugin. So I knew that worked, so I just pointed to that. So that's really, it's fairly simple to set up. You want to get all the right plugins, for Maven and Git. And typically in large organizations, you probably even have Jenkins administrators who probably already have that in place. So here's the first job, check out and generate sources. So here's the configuration. Again, it's not real complex, but you got to get everything correct, So once you do it once, you can create a checklist and screen prints, and my team has all of that. So we're able to repeat this fairly regularly. Very regularly. So here's your, this is actually where you configure get project. So you put the project in this Maven Jenkins project. You're actually pointing to Git. You have credentials, and then you point to the master. So this will get all of the projects, and you can build all the projects. And then the goals and options are fairly straightforward. We have a POM, and that's documented in Talend's documentation. Didn't change that a whole lot. You're generating, that's the option, and you're using the CI Builder. This is using the CI Builder, but it's also for Jenkins. That's the plugin for Jenkins, which is actually using a command line that's running. So in 6.3.1, you can actually do a local version of command line where it starts up command line every time you kick off a CI build. We did that, and we found that it didn't work in Linux, so I opened a ticket, and that's probably going to be fixed in the next release. So right now, I'm actually have a committed command line running on a different port than TAC that is actually taking and generating the source code. So that's really that's the configuration to build source. I love that CI Builder. It's a great thing to have to be able to automate. And then as a standard, I use a custom workspace just so I know where my workspace. I'm not guessing what the default Jenkins workspace is. And then a file path to configuration. And again, these are all in the documentation, but I would create a checklist yourself just so you make sure you cover everything, because there's a lot of steps. There's a few steps, not a lot. So that's basically it. And I want to show you what this generates. So we have a workspace in this, just like we do in Studio Eclipse, and it's actually going to generate under your project a source, and this is where your Java is. And there's your Java. Now, if I was to run this build again, this target would go away. So this target is brought in by the test run. And I don't want to take time running these. They don't take very long, but I just want to focus on what the results are. So if I ran the generate sources, this target would go away. So that's one way that it's really not building or compiling. So it's kind of confusing. CI Builder really builds source. It doesn't build like or compile. Those terms are kind of confusing at times. So that's the first step. So we have source code at that point. Now the next one, we're going to build the code and run tests. So let me show you what a test looks like. I think you probably have all seen this before, but for those who haven't, I have a standard job here. And I can right click on a component. And I just know from experience that if you have a map, that's the kind of the best place to start, because if you click here, it's kind of a limited test case. So you kind of want to, you know, as you get more familiar, you'll develop standards of how you create your test case. But you would generate a test case and it looks like this. So from a map, the test case looks actually like this. It's going to come up with like a file compare. So you basically have a run that you know is good, and you save it to like a temporary file or a test file. And then every time you rerun it, it's going to do a file compare and assertion to make sure that those are the same. So from the first time you develop this code and you know that your test is good, if somebody comes in, you know, refactors a date conversion or something like that, or something gets unmapped, it will you'll pick that up in the test. So let me go and let me show you what that what a test job looks like. And again, I'm really here today to kind of like lessen people's like apprehensions or fear, because like if you see how simple to set up a test is, you'll wonder why you haven't done this sooner. So this is a test. I've pointed to the POM file I generated in the generate source code, and this is in the documentation. And then this is the option to just run those tests, which generates the code first. And then again, I have the default workspace in my default settings file. And I'll show you what a run looks like. That's one thing about Jenkins is great history. So you can configure here, you can run it, and while it's running, you can come down here and look at the console output. If you look, it will tell you how many tests passed and failed. So I have one test and it passed. So that's really, you know, hopefully that gets rid of some apprehension when you see that these are fairly simple to implement once you have everything configured correctly. So then the last one is to package like into a zip file and publish to Nexus. And the one important thing I want to point out here, and again, I talk a lot about version, but I think that's probably like whenever I worked in services and ESB and you know, just anything you expose to another party or that you might have, you know, changes or advancements to, you're going to want a version. So you might have multiple versions that exist at one time. And I would say in the data management space, if you're going to have multiple versions that exist at the same time, I would do that through naming personally. So you can have those in the same, you know, same project, same version, and kind of move those through independently. That's my recommendation. But the one thing I wanted to point out, this is the version in Git. You see this 0.1? That's the version in Git. And that's when you run the CI process, that's what ends up in Nexus as well, unless you override it. And with the CI builder, there's really no way to override it. So this kind of comes back to how can you automate this process as well as to match your versioning strategy. So you could actually, you know, manually change these versions by right-clicking and open another version. That will actually create a new version. I don't really recommend that you do that. I did it here just as a demonstration. So when you actually, if I ran the build, I would see in Nexus, I'll show you here. That build is what shows up as the published version as well, unless you override it. And you can't really do that from CI Builder. You could do it from TAC. If you do one job at a time, you can't do it if you do all the jobs. So here's the version. See, I've been testing But right now, if I didn't make any changes to CI Builder, it would come to 01. And it's important, I don't want to get into too much detail, but I'll give you the gotchas. You can only do CI Builder against releases. You can't do it against snapshots. And if you want to run it more than once with the same version, you got to allow redeploy, which kind of goes against the whole reason of a release, because typically a release is disable redeploy. But and here's what I recommend in that case is create a separate repository that is not released as a snapshot that is your CI repository. And it's a release, but it behaves like a snapshot. The only difference between a snapshot and a release typically is that a snapshot kind of is mutable and it has a date appended to it. A release, you can only release something once unless you change this allow redeploy. And that's kind of the point of a release, is to not make it mutable. So, so that's that. Let's go back to our model here and go to the next step. So, so now we're publishing to Nexus, and I'll show you how simple that is. Again, it looks a lot like the test, about that complex. But there's some underground configuration that's done, but it's all in your checklist. So it's really just a deploy, and then here you have to point it to something in a configuration file that gives it like a context. And this is, we just use TAC like the Talend documentation tells you to. And then I pointed it to my specific repository that I'm using for Jenkins. And we'll take a look at this output real quick. So, honestly, this looks real technical, but I think all these visual reports and everything kind of help you understand what's happening. If you can see it in the source code, you can see the generated code. Actually, let me go back here. We'll look at one of these outputs, console output. It's basically taking and building your zip files and publishing those. And if you try to do it as a snapshot, you're going to get this, just going to throw errors all over the place. And I contacted the support and see if there's any way to do that configuration-wise, and they recommended that I stick with releases. So, okay. One thing I didn't show you is, here's the target. This happens after step 2. This is where the classes get generated after you run step 2. So under the project, each of these, the first step, generate source, you'll see Java with .class indicates that it's compiled. So that's pretty much the continuous integration pieces. Now, it's kind of the fun part. What can you do kind of beyond that, and kind of take that to the next level? You could do things like tag builds. That way, if a build turns into a release to a higher environment like QA, you can always branch that and label that or actually, have a published version that matches that in Nexus. This can be a whole, webinar within itself. But what typically we recommend is that you branch at a release for production support, and what that does is it allows you to do maintenance on the branch, which is kind of opposite of what you typically do in a Java environment. Because I personally don't recommend trying to merge changes back into the trunk. So what I recommend is you branch for a release, do the production support there. If you find that you have to make changes, rather than, you could try to do, see what kind of success you have merging things back in, but we typically in the past, especially before we went to Git, we would do dual maintenance. Sounds bad, but that's just the way it is. Make it better to find out now than to get into a bunch of trouble later. And again, I'm just reiterating probably what I think is the most important points. You can increment Git. It's kind of confusing. Maybe I always keep the same version. You can increment Nexus, and I highly recommend that. And let me show you what you can do to automate DevOps from a programmatic standpoint. So say you have 600 jobs and you've gone through CI, continuous integration through however many builds you have in your sprint, and you're ready to release to QA. You can use command line within a job. And what that is I do a system command here. So I'm calling this command line script, but I'm feeding it parameters, and these parameters are things like I want to list the jobs. So if I list all 600 jobs, I can create another script which actually versions all 600 jobs or publishes all 600 jobs under a different published version. And I'll show you what that looks like. So I basically so this first one, I did list jobs, and that will give you an output like this. It'll just give you like a console output. And in these you can actually put these to global variable. Then in the Java, I just parsed out those jobs and created this command, which I can run. So this is actually a publish command. I'll show you that one as well. And I wrote it to a file. So here's the publish. So I created, there's all my jobs. I'm doing a publish. And see, here's the key. I have a published version in Nexus that's different than the version in Talend. So again, you can't really do that from TAC, because if you go in here to publish, let's see how cooperative my VM is. We'll come back to that. But once you say publish all, you can't modify the published version. So and just to kind of give you so I highly recommend, I think the big takeaway is highly recommend that you get familiar with command line and meta servlet and figure out your strategy ahead of time. How are you going to tag? How are you going to version? How are you going to deploy? So you think about this in terms of, like, CI doesn't necessarily always mean deployment, but if you created a job like this and you wanted to list all your jobs and do a deployment to like a dev test server or a QA test server, you could, think about what you can do from the studio. You can actually do a remote run, right? So you can do a deploy from command line, or you could do it from meta servlet. So I could, with a little bit of modification, and I did this kind of it's really just stringing, and you could parameterize a lot of this. So basically, once I had those jobs, I just generated these commands. So I did a init, just like the command line in the studio. You do an emit, a login, and then you start going through, like I did a while loop to actually do all of the jobs into a publish. But you could change this to deploy, and have a job that once you've listed all your jobs, you can do that deploy, and then all the parameters, fill in all the parameters, and create a script, and then run that script. One thing that I ran into is kind of a funky thing. I'm going to do some more testing, but if I run this script to list jobs and then I write the script, if I try to do another OS command, it runs into a JVM issue. But if I take the script and run it at a different command line, it runs fine. I'm going to try to figure out why that is. I think it's like my .j emitters is having an issue, but I'm sure I can figure out how to get past that. But I mean, once you generate that script, you can run that manually or have that scheduled or whatever you want. Because it's kind of, when you run the script, you're assuming that all the code is frozen and it's ready to go. So I'd recommend a strong process of figuring out when it's done, and when it's done, generate your scripts, and then schedule those scripts in your maintenance windows or whatever. So you're probably not going to want to do this all at once anyways. Maybe it's going to be more manual process. Somebody's going to babysit that, or you can run that through a schedule, or run it from a job server. I think the issue here is more with the studio, when I couldn't run like more than one command line at a time. So let's see how we're doing on time here. So that's really what I wanted to show you. Let me come back to the slide here. Hopefully that was just not too much in the weeds. I think that the big takeaway is don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of a continuous integration. The tools are fairly simple to use. Like a small configuration can cause you problems, like trying to use this to a snapshot versus a release. That probably cost me a few hours, if not a half day, to try to get that to work, and figure out that it's not possible. with the way palms are generated. And the other thing too is in the new version of documentation, I believe that, yeah, I actually know for a fact that this configuration is missing in the doc. I'll show you. And I opened up a ticket for it. And the way I figured out how to do this, this configuration is missing in 6.3.1 doc, but I looked at the 6.2.1 doc and I figured out by the errors I was getting and the way the 6.2 doc was that I needed to put this parameter in. So if you want to save yourself a lot of work, take a screenshot of that right now. So that's pretty much it. I think, that, again, the key thing is get your strategy, don't be afraid, and then really leverage your developers to create jobs and scripts that will help your operations and administration people. So at that, I'll kind of shut up and let Josh take over. And
yeah, thanks, Robert. You can go back to that. I mean, everyone knows where to contact us. Go back to the previous slide because want to kind of just open it up right now for any questions. You know, Robert just scratched the surface here, but again, we want to mitigate your risk into implementing continuous integration in your environment. And obviously, you know how to get a hold of us to help enable that. So if you have any questions after seeing kind of what Robert's gone through, there's a chat feature in Join Me. And if you just want to post the chat to the all, and we can all see the questions coming in, and we can take it away here, and Robert can answer them. And while that's happening, I guess also too, you know, kind of stay tuned. We're going to be doing these webinar thought leadership pieces and knowledge transfers more frequently on topics that the community is asking for. So, you know, continuous integration, again, we had great success with this client, and so we wanted to share that. But we also have, we'll have one coming out on the ingestion framework. And again, this is all specific to our audience of using the Talend stack and kind of enabling our partnership with the Talend tools. So ingestion framework with Talend, Data Vault, conversion strategy from legacy system to Talend. You know, specifically, we know there's DataStage, Informatica, Ab Initio, and so on. So those are some of the topics that will be coming out here in the next few months that we'll be doing webinars on. So if there's any other questions or any other topics that you feel are relevant, please reach out to us as well that you'd like to see, you know, whether demo on, high-level concepts, things to help enable you in your business. So there's no questions coming through right now, which means that we've completely scared everybody away. You did a good job, Robert. So looks like we got one posted here. Can you cover how we can manage the approval process from dev to UA and production in different infrastructures?
yeah, so that's a good question, and I think I understand what you're saying. So it like you said, it's a process, and so basically the way I foresee that is you develop, you build, and then when you get to the point where you want to start a QA test, you move it to QA, and once that code is certified, that's where I would use these scripts. And I don't have a script that moves things between Maven repositories, so that question always comes up. Like, how do you decide that it's done, that's ready to go to test, and move it to the test Nexus repository? So there's really no way, there's nothing out of the box to do that. You can get creative with that, and that could be one of the things you write. Or, you know, typically, if you think about it, a Nexus repository, if you're doing a pull from it into each of the environments, everybody just has their own user ID, and if you have it in one environment, you know that it's always that same code. You know, it's always that same release, and it's not mutable, so it's pretty hard to hack into there and change that. So I kind of recommend that you use one Nexus repository, but if your network people won't allow that, then they're going to have to allow you to move things between Nexus repositories and create, you know, a Maven script or a Jenkins plugin to do that. And there's not even a way to do that in command line or meta servlet without rebuilding it. You could probably do it with a pre-generated job. So if you really want to get creative, you could do a pre-generated job that moves something into a different repository. But then it's like pulling it out of Nexus or using a different place than Nexus. So I personally wouldn't recommend that. So hopefully, did that answer your question, Fazal? Yeah, so that's a tough one. That's a great question. And it always comes up. And you know, I love Talend, and I think they're very talented developers. But the way the product improves is if you put things on your roadmap. And if enough people say on the roadmap, I really want a quicker, like a more convenient handshake between Dev Nexus and QA Nexus, I can't think of a reason why they wouldn't do that if enough people had that high enough on their priority list. And I actually would encourage people to do that if you think that's an issue. I think it would be a really nice feature to have. Or, you know, if it's really an interest, let me know, and I'll figure out a way to do it, and I'll have another webinar on it. Then you won't really need it in the release. I don't think it would be that hard.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining. Thank you, Talend, for allowing us to demonstrate this and for having such a slick tool. Again, you can get a hold of us. We have most of your contact information as you got this invite, but feel free to reach out at any time. And again, thank you. Have a great St. Patrick's Day tomorrow and a great weekend. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.